Hello everybody, Curious Corduroy here, and you are listening to the Save Data Podcast. It's just going to be me today, a solo episode, and we have a mountain of gaming news to get through that's come out within the past few months that we've been sitting on for a while, and I didn't want to keep sitting on this news, so I figured I'd get on here and do an episode by myself so we could talk about some stuff. Starting with the PlayStation VR 2. Now, my experience with VR is pretty minimal. I used what most people would probably consider basic bitch VR, which was the Samsung Gear VR. And even though that was like towards the bottom tier of VR, it was still really impressive. To be able to take my cell phone, slot it into this headset, and just have it work was really nice. And I remember the Jurassic Park VR demo in particular, and how realistic it all looked and felt. And to see this dinosaur in front of me that looked real, that felt like it was right in front of me, was astonishing. I haven't used a PlayStation VR. I've seen people, wear them, and there's tons of cables coming out of them, and it's like some weird contraption out of Saw. And I know Impulse Paradox does have a PlayStation VR, so I would love to get his input on this topic in particular. But we're talking about the PlayStation VR 2 now, which was announced a couple of months ago. And it sounds like it's going to have a lot of amazing tech built into it. They're really touting things like the visual fidelity, which it's going to have a high fidelity visual experience offering 4K and HDR with a 110 degree field of view. It's going to have an OLED display, which if you've ever used any type of OLED display, you know how amazing those screens can be. Those panels are just astonishing. The saturation, the black levels, the brightness, and the contrast. Once you use something OLED, it's mighty difficult to go back to something like LCD or even just standard LED. It's going to have a display resolution of 2000 by 2040 per eye, which is also really cool. That will allow for smoother frame rates of around like 90 to 120 hertz. A lot of the features that they're really touting with the VR2 headset are the headset-based controller tracking as well as sensory features and cameras. The cameras will be used for eye tracking. There's going to be 4 distinct cameras within that headset, and they could be used anywhere from just your regular field of view or for button inputs and prompts. So I imagine like maybe you're playing a VR Resident Evil and looking at a door will bring up the button prompt rather than you actually having to approach the door to open it. That's where my mind kind of goes. But they will have controller tracking, so your headset will communicate with your controllers, which they've showed off the controllers. If you've seen the Oculus Quest controllers, they are very similar to those in design, and I assume that they will probably operate in the very same manner as well. The thing that's really standing out though are the sensory features. It's going to have Sense technology that combines that eye tracking we just talked about with feedback from the headset and the audio. And one thing in particular that they keep talking about is vibration. These built-in motors in the headset that will vibrate according to what you're seeing or playing in a game. And it really reminds me of what they do with the DualSense controller on the PlayStation 5. Playing a game like Returnal, for example. If you're walking through the world and it starts to rain, you can feel the raindrops hitting the controller. It's really crazy to just talk about. And it's something that, again, you got to experience to really appreciate how cool this technology can be. Even something like Ghost of Tsushima, when you're riding your horse, the feeling of riding on grass compared to stone, compared to sand, feels different. So the fact that this type of technology is going to be in the headset is really cool. And I imagine like you're playing a game again like Returnal, let's say, and you have this headset on. If it starts to rain, could you potentially feel the raindrops hitting your headset? Could it actually feel like you're in a rainstorm? That kind of stuff is really cool, and Sony's developers are really creative, and I think they could find some really cool ways to really highlight this new feature and have it be more than just a gimmick, which is really exciting. Now, as I mentioned before, there is a ton of technology thrown into this machine, and I'm positive that this VR headset is going to be incredibly expensive. It would be nice if they could somehow go into the ballpark of $300, but I'm really thinking this thing is going to be $400 minimum, maybe even $500. The amount of tech that's in it is just, it sounds expensive. On the plus side, though, it does seem like Sony is trying to make this as accessible as possible. And I say that because this headset will just require one USB-C Type-C cable. And that's it. That's all you will need to power it. Compare that to the standard VR, and there's all these different cables coming out of it. To only have to use one USB cable to power the entire device seems like they're really trying to make that aspect of the headset as accessible as possible. Keeping in line with Sony, we're talking about Sony's Project Spartacus, which is said to be Sony's take on what Microsoft has as Game Pass. And Sony already does have a very similar service with PlayStation Now, although it's been marketed very terribly. There's still people out there that think that it's a streaming-only platform, which it's not. Unfortunately, the PlayStation 3 games on that platform have to be streamed in order to be played, but games like PlayStation 2 games or PlayStation 4 games can be streamed or downloaded so you can play locally from your console. So that's still a really nice feature. However, Sony has yet to have an official entry into this Game Pass-like environment. And it's been rumored that Project Spartacus will be that. It will take a library, which this is really cool, of PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation Portable games into this service, which is already like the catalog of PlayStation 1 games and PlayStation 2 games in particular already, just has me really excited as to what we could see. But the fact that they're including PSP games too is also really cool. I know the PSP didn't exactly do well, and neither did the Vita, but they did have some really cool and interesting games that were on those services and consoles. And if they can somehow bring these games back and maybe clean them up a little bit, or if you could somehow retroactively add, online multiplayer to games that already had multiplayer, this could be a really cool feature for the service. As I might have said earlier, they're combining it with PlayStation Plus. They will most likely keep the PlayStation Plus moniker as to not confuse people. And it's going to be a tier-based system. So if you look at something like PlayStation Now, a 1-month subscription, I believe, costs $9.99, whereas a full year subscription only costs $60. And if you look at something like Game Pass, PlayStation Now is so much more affordable compared to Game Pass. Game Pass, I believe, is $45 for 3 months or 4 months, and that's for the Ultimate Game Pass, Ultimate variety. And looking at PlayStation Now, with that being $60 for a full year, and it's got a pretty decent library of games on it, now might be the time to sign up for a service like PlayStation Now, and potentially you could be grandfathered into whatever this new Game Pass-like thing Sony is actually working on. Nobody really knows for sure, but that would be a really nice feature. Now, one thing that Sony's been hounded on is their lack of backwards compatibility and how the feature itself feels kind of half-assed. Now, if they come out with this Game Pass-like feature, it could potentially be an answer to backwards compatibility. You can play your PlayStation 1, PS2, PlayStation 3, the PSP games now, and hopefully they will work. The backwards compatibility on a PS5 is pretty hit or miss. I remember playing The Warriors with Impulse, and the game worked, but it was janky. There was issues with the menu and music and the UI and graphics not appearing correctly, and this could potentially be Sony's way of doing backwards compatibility the right way. And that's really exciting because I love the library of games that Sony has built up over the years since PlayStation 1. And to me, that's a really huge value. And looking at something like Game Pass, I don't really use my Xbox all that much. So Game Pass, although it really is a great deal for a lot of people, it's not really great for me because I'm not as interested in a lot of the titles that Xbox has to offer, or even some of the third-party titles that they have to offer on that service. Gaming subscriptions could potentially be the future for some companies. I think that Microsoft in particular is going full steam ahead with Game Pass. I believe that that is their new platform now. It's not Xbox anymore, it's Game Pass. It's an ecosystem. Whereas Sony, they care about selling consoles still. They still care about selling you their really damn good first-party titles. And I view Spartacus as something that could just be a bonus, an add-on. It might not ever be the main thing that Sony does, but it's going to be a part of their ecosystem. Whereas Microsoft seems really dead set on trying to get Game Pass on everything possible and make that their new main platform. In our last bit of Sony news, they recently purchased Bungie for $3.6 billion, which my first reaction upon hearing this news was, I kind of think maybe they overpaid. Bungie isn't exactly the company that they used to be. I know that Destiny 1 and 2 didn't quite blow up the way that Bungie and Activision probably hoped it would, but it's still a very successful franchise that makes money, and you can't really be too upset, with what happened with Destiny, if you're Bungie or Activision, because you got two games out there that made you a lot of money. But I think the main reason that Sony purchased Bungie wasn't to try and get some kind of Destiny-like game or to make Destiny 3 exclusive. I think they bought them purely for their experience when it comes to not just multiplayer games, but live service games, which is something that Sony seems to be really interested in and wanting to, get their feet wet with. And what better company to do that than Bungie, a studio that's made Destiny, that made Destiny 2, that know what it takes to create a large live service type game. And with that, they can still pull people from Bungie and place them in different spots at Sony's game studios to help with any type of expertise, whether it be multiplayer, first-person shooter, and not just live services. Another big thing that Sony mentions is that Bungie will in fact remain independent, meaning their games, as of now anyway, will remain multi-platform and not exclusive to Sony consoles, which, it definitely gives you the thought that Sony bought them purely for their live service and multiplayer expertise rather than to try and acquire the next big Halo, But they could potentially get that somewhere down the line. Another positive thing to note is that with most corporate mergers, people will unfortunately lose their jobs. However, Sony has stated that Bungie will remain intact and their workforce will not be lessened. So thankfully, people won't be losing their jobs. They're just going to have the benefit of Sony backing them now, which is really cool. And in the last bit of news, Microsoft purchased Activision Blizzard for nearly $70 billion. Now, to put that in perspective, Nintendo as an entire company is worth about $60 billion. So Microsoft spent a Nintendo and roughly 3 Bungies to acquire Activision Blizzard. Now, most of my notes for this story are kind of outdated because this is something that is just ever evolving, it seems. It seems like every week some new piece of news has been redacted or added or things are changing. But when this acquisition was made, it was thought to be believed that after the year 2023, which was the end date for Activision's deal with Sony in regards to Call of Duty, that everything would eventually become exclusive to the Xbox ecosystem. Phil Spencer did try to reassure people, saying that he did have talks with people at Sony that they wanted to keep those games on PlayStation. They didn't want to separate the player base or create any type of problems like that. The cynical side of my brain thinks that eventually, somewhere down the line, these games will become exclusive to the Xbox ecosystem. Now, what makes this kind of funny is that the day that this announcement was announced, which that sounds really redundant, the FCT announced that they would be coming down much harder on corporate mergers. And that would start with Microsoft's merger with Activision Blizzard. And out of that, I think a lot of things in Microsoft's and Xbox plans changed. I think they initially did want to keep these games exclusive to Xbox after the year 2023, but because the FCT is just breathing down their necks and they're under that microscope right now, I think Microsoft is kind of just saying whatever the FCT wants. Anything to get them off their back, and then maybe somewhere down the line, they can take games like Call of Duty or World of Warcraft or even Overwatch and make them exclusive to their Xbox ecosystem. They're trying to reassure people right now that that will not happen, but again, the cynic in me thinks that they're saying that purely just to smooth things over with the FCT, and then somewhere down the line, that will change and these games will be locked behind Xbox. I'm not sure if doing that is a really good idea because the Call of Duty player base is just so large on PlayStation. It's much more massive than the PC and the Xbox side of things. And to completely take that away down the line would be a lot of lost money, and a large portion of your player base is just now gone. And that's not exactly a good, idea to try and do that. Now, one of the downsides, again, with corporate mergers is that most people will probably lose their jobs, which is really unfortunate. The plus side, though, is that someone as vile as Bobby Kotick, however you want to pronounce that fool's name, he will eventually be leaving as CEO of Activision Blizzard, which is a hallelujah moment. I don't really want to make light of this situation in particular because Bobby is just a revolting person, and the things that went on at Activision Blizzard over the years are really sickening and disappointing. You know, we're talking about not just a toxic workplace, but sexual harassment and sexual assault, and Bobby Kotick potentially protecting the people who were committing those crimes and shunning those who were reporting them, the victims. It's kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, if this acquisition does go through, which it's said to go through in the fiscal year of 2023 for Microsoft, then that means Bobby is out. Unfortunately, he will be out with a ton of money in his pocket, but whatever you got to do to get that demon out of this area, you got to do it. And once the acquisition is final, everyone will now be reporting to Phil Spencer and his group of people, which means that Phil Spencer now has a new title. He's not just the CEO of Xbox, he's now the CEO of gaming at Microsoft, which is pretty massive. That's a major upgrade for someone like Phil Spencer, and he's proven time and time again that he knows what he's doing. This is a guy that took an Xbox brand that was on life support and breathed new life into it and brought it back. And sure, they're still in third place behind Sony and Nintendo, but they're actually competing again, and they're not having one foot in the grave. And if there's somebody that can clean up a toxic work environment like that and make it a safer environment, it is Phil Spencer. He seems like such a genuine person who wants to do right by not only the people he works with, but by gamers. And I know, like I said earlier, that the cynic in me believes that all of this stuff will become exclusive to Microsoft after a while. But I genuinely don't think Phil Spencer wants that. You know, if there's anybody there that wants an open platform where these games are on PlayStation and on Nintendo systems, it's going to be him. But unfortunately, there are still people that work above Phil Spencer that can overrule him and might potentially want some of these games to go exclusive somewhere down the line. Now, as I said before, this story is constantly changing, and with the FCT being involved, new stuff can come out. Things might change. There's a slim chance that this merger doesn't even go through, but it sounds like, for the most part, that it will actually happen. Now, the one thing that I want to touch on before we end this episode of the podcast is comparing both Microsoft and Sony's approaches to acquiring new studios and IPs. Microsoft often gets, lambasted for the way that they acquire studios, and I'm kind of on that same side where the way they're doing it feels kind of icky in a way because they're such a large company with seemingly infinite money at their disposal. I believe they make anywhere from I think $50 billion is how much Microsoft actually made in their last fiscal year. So they've got just an astounding amount of money constantly coming in, which, they can afford acquisitions like this. But when Microsoft does it, it does feel a little bit icky in a way because they're going out and buying whole companies like ZeniMax just to get access to game devs in their studios. And by doing this, they're gaining dozens upon dozens of not just developers, but their IPs as well. So in a way, it does feel like they're taking the easy way out. Now, you compare that with how Sony handles things, it feels a little neater, a little nicer, I guess, because Sony doesn't just go and grab entire companies. They're grabbing developers, here and there, and a majority of the devs that they're grabbing, they do have relationships with. You look at Blue Point Studios, which they acquired recently. They have, a decade-long relationship with that company. They just recently acquired Bungie, and even by acquiring Bungie, it seems like Bungie is going to be allowed to be independent. Over the years, they acquired Naughty Dog and Insomniac Games because they had relationships with them. So I think when Sony does it, it doesn't feel as weird or gross because it seems to be one dev every now and again. Whereas Microsoft is like, I just entered an entire buffet and I want everything in that buffet. In fact, you know what? Screw that. I'm just going to buy the entire buffet and then call it a day. So the way they handle these things does seem a little different. It's safe to say that Microsoft will continue acquiring more companies. Who's next on their list? Nobody really knows. Sony has also stated that they will be making more acquisitions down the line. And I can't help but feel like Sony is going to acquire two companies in particular. I just feel it in my bones, and that is Square Enix and Capcom. And I bring those two studios up because Sony has a really long storied history with these Japanese companies. You know, it dates back to the PlayStation 1 even. You look back then in games like Final Fantasy 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 were all exclusive to Sony PlayStation consoles. You know, games like Resident Evil started off as exclusive to, you know, the PlayStation. Eventually they would come to, you know, the N64 and the Dreamcast and in later generations Xbox. But there's just something about the relationship Sony has with those two companies in particular that I feel like if they were going to be bought out by anybody, it would be Sony. And in the case of Square, I know they've mentioned in the past that they are not looking to be bought, but eventually, you know, if you hear people out, money will talk, and eventually that's going to pay off. Now, Sony might not have the money that Microsoft has, but Sony is also a Japanese company, and I think that's something that's important to Square Enix. I think if they were to be bought by somebody, they would want it to be a Japanese company like Sony, because even though Sony's grasp of the gaming space in Japan is not as strong as it once was, it's still there. People still respect PlayStation and Sony in Japan. People are still purchasing PlayStation 4s and PlayStation 5s, if you can even find them, in Japan. Whereas Microsoft never got their footing in Japan. And to this date, their launch in Japan from Xbox One to current Xbox consoles has been absolutely abysmal. So I don't think Square or Capcom would want to be purchased by a company that barely has a presence, you know, in a place where they originated from that still is incredibly important to them as a market. So I can't help but feel like those two companies are going to be next for Sony. And if I'm being honest here, and maybe it's my inner fanboy, I feel like Sony purchasing them would be fine. It would be normal. Nothing about that would be weird. Now, if Microsoft purchased Square or Capcom, that would be fucking weird. To have Final Fantasy games, Resident Evil games exclusive to Microsoft platforms? Like, what? Am I taking crazy pills over here? That would be so weird. It would be gross. It would feel icky. It would just feel really wrong. And maybe that's my inner fanboy. And I don't know. But with Sony, it just feels like it would be normal. Now, I do want to end this conversation by saying my hope is that none of these companies get bought up by Sony or Microsoft. People like Square and Capcom or Bandai Namco, they do so much more than just make games, which I think would make it kind of difficult to be outright purchased. You know, Square in particular has their hands in so many different markets in the gaming industry, and so does Bandai Namco, for example. But at the end of the day, I would love for these companies to just remain independent. Being purchased up can offer a financial boon. It can offer so many new resources to create games, but that also takes, you know, games away from a section of gamers that might not have your console. You know, you look at games like Call of Duty. That's a massive game. If Microsoft were to just someday take that away from PlayStation people, that would be kind of messed up when you really think about it. So my hope is that none of these companies get bought out, but I just can't help but feel like Sony is gunning for Square and Capcom, especially if you look at games like Final Fantasy VII Remake, which by now probably should have hit Xbox consoles, but something is keeping that game exclusive to PlayStation consoles. And that could potentially be the same with Final Fantasy XVI. That might be a PlayStation exclusive that might later come to PC. So you have all these deals and things happening behind the scenes, and for all we know, Sony could be in talks to acquire these companies already. You know, these acquisitions don't normally happen overnight or within a couple of weeks. A lot of times it takes months, sometimes up to a year for them to actually go through. So if anything is already happening, you know, we might find out about it by E3. So with that being said, I know this was kind of a weird podcast with it just being me in a basement with a microphone rambling random things about the gaming industry, but I am curious, Corduroy. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for listening. It really does mean a lot. And maybe I'll do more videos like this where it's just me talking about, you know, random news that happens to hit and drop at a certain time, so that way we're not just sitting on this news for months and months and months until it becomes outdated. But with that being said, you can follow me on Twitter if you like, @CuriousCorduroy. I don't really post too much, especially now since I'm in the middle of Horizon Zero Dawn. I'm trying to finish that before Forbidden West comes out. Absolutely loving the game. It's phenomenal. The DLC was great as well. Hopefully I can fit in some Sifu in between playing Zero Dawn and getting to Forbidden West. But again, Curious Corduroy on Twitter. If you're on my YouTube page already, then you can subscribe if you like. Take a listen to some of our older podcasts and watch some of my older video games. But again, if you made it to the end, thank you so much for listening, and it really does mean a lot. And I hope that everyone has a great day.